think about a subject in Torah that is particularly demanding, one of the most difficult areas of Torah thought, what we call machshava or hashkafa. And that's the very difficult problem of how one person's free will interacts with another. That very thorny philosophical problem, thorny religious problem. And that is the problem of how, if I use my free will to do something that affects you in a way that's inappropriate, what happens? In other words, if I use my free will, which is the defining characteristic of the human being, right? We know that the way the Torah puts it is that the human being is formed but Selam Aleykum, that means in a godly image. And the divine image, all our deep sources say, means that we have free will, right? That's a very mysterious thing, that we can be a cause of our own action and not simply a response, a feedback loop. So the most deeply axiomatic feature of the human being is our free will. And the problem is, one of the problems of free will, is that if you use your free will to affect someone else in a way that's not appropriate for their dispensation, what will happen? If I use my free will, let's say I do something dangerous, and I get harmed. There's no philosophical problem. I got harmed because I did something dangerous, not a philosophical problem. But if I put you into danger, where you don't deserve harm, in other words, you have a divine dispensation, we call that hashgacha. Hashgacha means there's a set of decrees in the spiritual world that govern what is your appropriate dispensation. What happens if I use my free will to affect you in such a way that goes against what's correct for you? Right? To put it most dramatically, what happens if somebody tries to kill someone else who doesn't deserve to die? Right? Somebody who has no divine decree of death on him at that point. I'm not talking about divine knowledge. Hashem's knowledge, God's foreknowledge, is a completely different subject, right? That's the classic problem of predestination or foreknowledge and free will. That's if possible, that's a more difficult subject than this evening's. And that's another whole issue. That's one classic problem in Jewish philosophy, and in fact in general philosophy. How does predestination or foreknowledge impact on our free will? That's one area. But the way we put this in formal Torah terms, we're not talking about divine knowledge, we're talking about decrees. Just to give it some sort of graphic feel, if you imagine Hashem, God, as being somewhere above the ceiling, right, out of sight, but he impinges on the world through a mechanism of interaction. Call that the zodiac world, whatever you want to call it. Spiritual energy is impinging on the world, and the channels that come into the world take the form of what's called gzeros, divine decrees. Why that is and how it operates and how they formed on Rosh Hashanah during the year is a long discussion. But there are certain things called decrees. And decrees are not strictly immutable. Right? For example, prophetic decrees for bad can be changed because they're conditional. There's a whole world of understanding of what these divine decrees are. The point to make for now is we're not talking about divine foreknowledge. We're talking about decrees. Right? But without going to it more specifically, what happens if Mr. A is walking down the street and he has no divine decree upon him to die at that time? In fact, if you interviewed Hashem at that time and you said, Hashem, God, how do you feel about this person? And Hashem would say, he's cool. From my point of view, he's got 25 more years to live, do lots of mitzvahs, get married, have a family. I'm fine with him. And at that point, Mr. B turns the corner and tries to kill him. We have a problem now. Because from the one point of view, this person does not deserve to die. That means if it was up to God, he wasn't going to kill him. On the other hand, we know the human being's free will. And you're created in the world to use your free will. There has to be very real. Well, we have a problem now. Which will supplant, which will override the other, right? If you say there's no free will to kill him, because this person's destiny, or whatever the appropriate word would be, the decree upon this person is not to die now, then you're pulling the teeth of the power of the free will of this agent. If, on the other hand, you say that he could kill him, there's something desperately unfair about that. That means his free will is very real, but the person's dying completely inappropriately. I mean, that's very, very strange. That's the dilemma, right? So let's take a look at this very difficult subject. Which of these principles is going to soften? Are we going to say that you don't have free will to affect anyone else? You only have an illusion of free will? Are we going to say that you do have free will and that your divine dispensation, the way Hashem's dealing with you and what you deserve in the world is somehow unreliable, somehow could someone else put you at risk? How do we approach this subject? Classic problem in Torah thought, very badly misunderstood subject. A lot of the stuff you'll read about this is misrepresented. Let me give you a scenario, fascinating setting on which to build this subject. Stay with me carefully, because in halachic settings, every nuance can make a major difference to the output. And here's the scenario. A long time ago, more than 100 years ago, a certain very learned rabbi happened to be visiting an expo, like a commercial fair. I think it was in Leipzig. And he found himself in a very strange dilemma. If you'd like to look this up, it's in the Pischei Tshuva, great halachic commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, in Choshen Mishpat Yud Ches. He actually analyzes this question, but I'm going to give you some more background that he doesn't mention there. But look it up, you'll find it fascinating. And this is what he says. This well-known and major Talmid Chacham, great rabbinic thinker, was visiting this particular place, and the procedure there was that if people had a financial dispute, they would make a Beis Din. They make a Jewish court, they'd co-opt 3 people to form a tribunal, and the litigants would present their cases, and the tribunal, the judges, would issue a ruling. In fact, the non-Jews there used to subject themselves to the same arbitration. That was the way it was done. 2 Jews on this particular occasion had some financial dispute, and so they considered Beis Din. What did they do? They co-opted 2 Jews who happened to be there at the time to be judges on the Beis Din, and for the 3rd judge, they put him on the Beis Din. He was a very accepted, knowledgeable halachic figure. He happened to be there. There was no way they could choose somebody else. And so the 3 of them sat. You know, the rule of a Beis Din is you always have an odd number of people, right? You can never have an even number of people. Why an American jury has 12 people? I've never figured out, right? It's just a recipe for trouble. You have always an odd number, so there can never be a hung decision. And therefore, the minimum number is 3. And so they made a Beis Din, and the 2 Jews began to present their cases. And this rabbi writes as follows. He says that it became immediately apparent to him that the other 2 judges were colluding dishonestly against the innocent party, and they were going to lie in their vote, and he would be carried along with a miscarriage of justice. Clearly they were biased in favor of one of the litigants. They were going to vote on his favor. The money would change hands, be complete miscarriage of justice. There's nothing he could do. Because in Jewish law, all you can do is vote. Well, he's going to vote, they're going to outvote him. And not only that, but he'll be carried along involved in that, because halachically, when a Beis Din issues a ruling, it comes down as a fiat of the whole Beis Din. You know, for example, if the 3 of us are sitting on a Beis Din, and we're judging your case, and they vote against me, I'm forbidden to go to you afterwards and say I was on your side, but they outvoted me. Not allowed to disclose that in Jewish law. In other words, the decision comes as if it was a unanimous decision of the Beis Din, and therefore, he would be carried along in this travesty of justice, and that was the problem. So what could he do? So he thought to himself he had 2 options. One option was to vote, which means that he'd vote for the truth. The other 2 outvote him, and the vote would carry in the favor of a dishonest result, and he'd be part of that. But he had another option. The other option was to say, I don't know. Because the Code of Jewish Law says that if one of the judges on a Beis Din says, I don't know, the case is closed. Or you co-opt 2 more, or you start again. But basically the case then ends because you're now left with only 2 active judges. That's an even number of judges. And that's an invalid Beis Din. And therefore he could have gotten out of the problem by saying, I don't know. But his moral dilemma was that in order to say, I don't know, he would have had to lie. Because he didn't know. So he thought, so what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to now say the truth and have a falsehood result? Or should I say false to have the truth result? Isn't that an amazing question? See, in Jewish law, the question is, what is the truth? Very sophisticated question, right? Is the truth the naked technical meaning of the words, or is the truth contextual? So in Jewish law, the truth is always contextual. You can't get away with the legalistic meaning of the words. You're sitting at home, the phone rings, your wife picks it up. From her tone of voice, you hear that this is somebody you definitely don't want to speak to. So this is what you do. You step out across the doorway, and you say, I'm not home. And your wife says, I'm sorry, he's out. Would you say that's a lie or the truth? It's technically true, but in Jewish law it's a lie. It's a worse lie than remaining in the room and saying I'm not available. Because the question is not asking which side of the doorstep your husband's standing. That's not the meaning of the question. You can't get out of it when that technicality, right? And therefore, in Jewish law, if you want to look this up, by the way, this is all based on Yaakov saying that he's Esav. When Yaakov said he was Esav, right, technically speaking, he was lying. But in truth, he was Esav. He had taken over that persona. He'd bought it. I am Esav, your firstborn. I have those rights. I've bought. It's a very fascinating area. You need to look it up. There's a lot of halachic discussion about that. But the question is here, what is called the truth? And therefore, to vote for the truth and have falsehood result is one option. But to say false, which is I don't know, and have a greater truth result, maybe that's correct. So he says there, and he wrote this question to the Pischei Tshuva, who analyzes it. So he said he still thought about it, and he thought to himself, maybe there's a precedent in the Gemara. The Gemara says, what happens in the following scenario? Let's say you have the Sanhedrin. You know, for a capital trial in Judaism, you need like 23 judges or 71 judges, so many, many rules. You need many conditions for the great Sanhedrin that judges capital cases. What happens in the following scenario? Let's say you have someone, this man's on trial for his life, and you are the gentleman of the Sanhedrin. I'm sure you all duly qualified halachically. And you are going to sit and constitute this tribunal that's going to try this man for his life. Now, you know that the laws of capital cases in Judaism are very extreme. You know that you have all sorts of stringencies. It's virtually impossible to get a death sentence in Jewish law. For example, you don't need a simple majority to convict. You need more than that. Many, many preconditions. But one of them is this. They used to sit in a semicircle. That's how they sat, so they could all see each other. And when the case was finally heard and the arguments were concluded, they began the vote, and they always voted from the junior to the senior. Right? They voted from the most junior member of the Sanhedrin through to the most senior. What was the reason for that? They didn't want anyone to be influenced by a prior senior opinion. So they voted in order of seniority. So imagine you're going to be the junior on this. I mean, you have to be major to be on the Sanhedrin. Okay? And we're going to go around in order. And you're going to be the final, you don't mind giving. You're going to be the final black belt, 10th Dan, Mufla Shibbas, the great genius of the generation. They start voting. Now, there's a remarkable condition here that the non-Jewish world does not have. And that is that you need a majority to convict. Yeah? Not just a majority. You need more than a majority of one to convict. But there's a remarkable quirk here that the non-Jewish world doesn't have. And that is that there's one particular proportion of majority to convict that in fact acquits. There's one particular proportion that if that proportion of majority says guilty, right, that unique proportion, in fact, paradoxically acquits the accused. What proportion is that? Unanimous. If there's a unanimous verdict that is guilty, he's free. Make sense? Well, the logic is, there's a lot to talk about here, but one theme here is this, that if nobody could think of anything is in defense, there's something wrong with this case. First of all Jews agreeing, I mean, there's definitely something wrong with that. I mean, that's no way agreeing. But the theory is that somebody has to argue in his favor. Somebody's got to try out, right? Say something in his defense. If there's no one to speak in his defense, then in fact, paradoxically, he gets acquitted. There's got to be somebody who says innocent enough. Imagine this. Man's on trial for his life, and the voting begins. Guilty, death, guilty, guilty, execute, guilty, guilty, guilty. Every single member of the Sanhedrin says guilty until he's to speak. And he knows that the man's guilty. Do you see the problem? If he speaks the truth and he says guilty, this man walks free. Actually, technically in halacha, he doesn't walk free, but he doesn't get one of the 4 classic death sentences that the Talmud requires. Other capital cases, he would walk free. Murder is different, but be that as it may. So now, everyone said guilty, and there's one vote left. If he says guilty, which is the truth, this man's acquitted, which is wrong. So what should he do? Should the last dayan on the Sanhedrin, should he say guilty, which is the truth, and have a man who's guilty walk free? Or should he say innocent to have him convicted, which is the truth? The Rambam writes, he must speak the truth. A judge has to judge in Jewish law, has to judge what his eyes see. And if he says guilty, he has to say guilty. This man walks free, that's his problem, not ours. That's what he rules. So he thought to himself, if that's true, I know what I have to do in my case, as you said. And therefore I have to speak the truth. And the Pischei Tshuva says, wrong. The two cases are not parallel. Now, to understand why they're not parallel, let's take a little detour and go through some of the areas of this fascinating question of whether one person's free will, in fact, affects others. There have been 2 approaches suggested to this. I'd like to try to convince you that one of them is correct. But if you look in the modern literature on this, halachic literature, you'll see 2 approaches to this presented. And I think very often mistakenly, one of them is presented as valid or even the dominant opinion. But there's no question there are 2 possible approaches to this question. One approach is that you never affect anyone else at all. All you can ever do is act, but you never are the author of the outcome, right? In other words, the only possible interpretation of A killing B is that B was going to die then anyway. That means A is guilty for pulling the trigger, for making the choice and pulling the trigger. And all the legal consequences apply. There's got no question that the legal consequences apply, but he never caused a death that wasn't going to happen otherwise. That means the truth of the situation is B was going to die then anyway. Only A chose to be the agent. But we have a principle called Harbe Shluchim L'Makim. Hashem has many agents. And if it had not been for B pulling the trigger, a scorpion would have he would have got a heart attack, a brick would have fallen off the building, a bus would have come around the corner, something would have happened, and he would have died then. That's one possible approach, which means that you never do something to someone else that's not fair or deserved. All you can possibly choose to do is to be the agent. But it hadn't been you, it would have been somebody else. Well, that's one possibility. And superficially, there are sources that seem to say that. For example, the classic source of all is Rav Saadia Gaon. When you look at his writings, he says something dramatically clear and as succinct. You know, in those days they spoke very short and very, very clear. And he says something exquisitely clear. He says, according to this approach, when somebody dies, all that happens is a death becomes a murder. Isn't that beautiful? You can't say it more clearly than that, right? The death was going to happen anyway. Now it's called a murder. Had you not pulled the trigger, he would have died. No, instead of dying, he got murdered. But he would have died then anyway. He says two things. He says that if somebody kills somebody else, all that happens is that death becomes a murder. And if somebody steals from someone else, all that happens is a loss, became a theft. But had he not stolen it, the person would have lost the money anyway, because you can't do something to somebody else that he doesn't deserve. That's not part of his dispensation. Hashem is conducting this person's affairs in direct response to what he deserves and needs, and therefore, and that is a superficial reading of Rav Saadia and the other sources that appear to say the same thing. I'll try to show you that I don't think it's correct. I think it's a misreading, that you never touch anyone else, and you only choose to act, and possibly act in the world, and possibly even cause consequences, but the consequences would have been anyway. This, of course, is very reassuring from the point of view of the victim, because nothing ever happens to you that wasn't going to happen anyway. But it's very problematic from the point of view of somebody perpetrating, using his free will in the world, right? Because it certainly seems that we are the actors. Right? Imagine this evening after this talk, you get in your car, you're lost in thought, I hope, and as you back out, some careless idiot backs right into you and makes a big dent in your car. And you'd say, look what you've done to my car. And the guy says, you're a religious Jew, aren't you? And you say, yes. He says, well, you must believe you had it coming. It was what it's going to do with me. Right? Does that sit right? I mean, well, maybe technically, but it doesn't feel that way. We certainly feel that when we act in the world, we are the authors of what happens in the world, right? It's going to happen anyway. Very hard to, take a lot of religious conviction to keep reminding yourself of that. But that is one possible approach. However, amazingly, there's another approach. And I think this is the correct one, and I'll try to prove it to you. And that is that your free will is so real and so important, you could do something to somebody else that he does not deserve. One possible interpretation of A killing B is that B was not going to die then. He was going to live for 25 more years, and A killed him. Right? Now, this is very concerning and worrying for the victim. This means you're at the mercy of human free will in a way that utterly unlike any other dispensation that comes your way. It's very empowering from the point of view of the person using his free will in the world. Because don't forget, if you don't say this, if you say that whatever you do in the world is only administering to somebody else what would have happened anyway, it means you can never affect anyone else at all. You can't help anyone, you can't harm anyone else. You could never do a mitzvah. For example, you couldn't give someone charity, tzedakah. According to first opinion, they were going to get it anyway. You get the mitzvah, there's no question about it. It's your merit, there's no question about that. But that you affected his life would be wrong. Because you could never benefit someone else if it wasn't part of his spiritual dispensation. So you get the mitzvah of acting, it's going to do it anyway. All your interactions would be this way. Imagine you're an ideal Jewish husband. 10 o'clock every night you make your wife a cup of tea. No matter how tired you are, exhausted, no matter what a bad day, you make yourself your wife a delicious cup of tea, and you bring it to her and you feel like a big deal because you made her tea. According to this way of thinking, had you not made it for her, someone else would have. She has it coming. Had you not done it, she's going to get it. She gets what she deserves. Kind of takes the teeth out of the feeling of your interactions in the world, right? So, and according to the second way of thinking, the teaching is, and there are many sources that say this, that you can affect someone else and do something, you can help somebody and know that had it not been for me, they would have died. I saved their life. Not just technically fitted into the role, but it would have happened some other way. I actually was the author of that. Of course, this opinion doesn't claim that it's always the case. This second opinion could readily agree that most human interactions fit into the first category, but at least holds that it's possible to do something to somebody else, good or bad, that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Let me bring you some proof. It's a very surprising, you have to understand, it's a very surprising approach, that somebody could kill someone else who is not going to die. That's incredible, right? A very, very distressing thought. But let me prove to you that it's true. First of all, I'll give you one very beautiful, succinct proof, and then a more formal and better known one. Here's the brief one. When we say tachanun, we say, Vayomer David el Gad, David said to God, Nipla na b'yad Hashem, let us fall into Hashem's hand. Ki Rabbi mirachamav, because His mercy is very great. Uvayad Adam ale pole, but let me not fall into human hand. Very telling. Very telling. David HaMelech, King David, is facing two possible options. He's got to face two kinds of dangers. Right? He can either choose a danger that is non-human. In fact, what happened was Hashem said to him, you're guilty of a certain sin, and you're going to suffer. But I'm giving you the choice of what kind of suffering you want. Do you want to go through an illness and a plague that will affect you and your people? Or do you want to deal with an enemy attack? And David said, Hashem, I'll take the illness. Because the illness comes directly from you and your hand is kind. But there's no trusting a Philistine soldier. Very telling. That means it makes a difference whether justice is administered by Hashem. Because the contrary way of thinking is, every bullet has your name on. Makes no difference. David should have said, I'll flip a coin. Whatever I get comes from you. According to the first way of thinking, right? Whatever you get is what you deserve. What difference does it make if it's a hungry mountain lion or some kind of pestilence or plague, or it's an enemy soldier? You're only going to get what you deserve. If that was the right way of thinking, David would have said, Hashem, what difference does it make? But he didn't do that. He said, Hashem, I'll deal with you and not with humans. There's no trusting a human. Ki Rabbi Rachamav, your mercy is great. You'll deal with me kindly. But a human being might deal with me cruelly. Right? You see, apparently it makes a big difference. By the way, there are so many proofs. I thought of one myself. I mean, in going through the researching for this book, there's obvious sources. One classic source is this. Why were the Egyptians held guilty for torturing the Jewish people when it was predicted? There were decrees. There was a divine decree hundreds of years before. God said to Abraham, they'll be enslaved in a strange land, they'll be tortured, they'll be enslaved, etc., etc. Exact prediction. And the Rambam says when there is divine prediction, you have real trouble. When there's divine foreknowledge, it's enough trouble. But a divine prediction openly revealed in the world, how can you move from that? The logic should be an Egyptian should turn to God and say, God, what are you punishing us for? We only fulfilled your decree. You decreed that the Jews would be enslaved in our country, right? So we did it. What do you want from us? You should reward us. When Joseph's brothers sold him, you remember the story? They felt that he was an imposter and he was a threat to them and threat to the Jewish people and the future, the history of the world. And what happened was Joseph approached his brothers and they said, behold, this dreamer of dreams approaches. Let's kill him and see what becomes of his dreams. Yes, let's kill him. Let's kill him and see what becomes of his dreams. The Chaim explains that what they were saying, look this up in Chumash because his language is very, very specific and very, very explicit, very clear. He says that they weren't speaking sarcastically, let's kill him and see what becomes. We're talking about people of cosmic greatness. Every word is measured and weighed. And what they meant was this. If we kill him, not only will we be correct in our doing, but we'll be seen to be correct. Why? Because Joseph dreamed that at some time in the future we'd bow down to him. Right? Let's say he is born, 17 years old, and he dreams that somewhere in the future we'll bow down to him. Right? Which we believe is a completely false not a prophecy, it's a false claim, right? It's a complete illusion, and he's a liar at this point. Well, if we kill him now, not only will we be justified, we'll be vindicated. Because the moment he dies, it's immediately apparent that we'll never bow down to the future because he's dead. Therefore, justice will be done and it'll be seen to be done. So let's kill him and see what becomes of his dreams. Meaning the dreams are now falsified. And because he dies, it's patently obvious that we were correct. Beautiful plan. So Reuven, the oldest brother, stepped forward and he said, gentlemen, you're making a serious philosophical error, a mistake in Ashkafa. You think that if you kill him, it'll be apparent that the dreams were false. I'm telling you an amazing novelty in Torah approach to the world. I'm telling you that you could kill somebody who does not deserve to die, who had valid dreams of prophecy, and you killed him. And you killed a man who was not destined to die. And you will mistakenly conclude that his dreams were false, but I'm telling you that his dreams were true. And we would have bowed down to him. But human free will is so important that Hashem's going to step back and say, free will, I'm not not interfering with that. I created the world for your free will. I'll reconfigure the whole computer system and the whole plans for history. I'll find another way. But I'm not going to controvert your free will. And therefore, although his dreams were prophetically true, again, there's a deep philosophical problem here. How could he have dreamed something about the future? Right? How could he have dreamed something about the future that then doesn't come true? And that's very, very... By the way, can you handle an aside in the discussion? Here's an aside. This is a constant problem in Torah, by the way. There's a constant problem in Torah that people see a future thing and that it might not be true. Right? The Pashas we're going through now. Think about it. It's a very challenging thing. Moshe Rabbeinu sees an Egyptian beating a Jew. Right? So it says, Vayifen koivakoi, he looked here and there. Vayar ki ein ish, he saw there was no man. Simple interpretation is no one watching. And so he killed him. Deep interpretation, says Rashi, and the commentaries say, he saw that there was no descendant of this Egyptian that was worthy. No good person would be descended from in the future, and because of that he killed him. In other words, had he seen prophetically that this Egyptian would have some outcome, some descendant in the future who would be meritorious and righteous, he wouldn't have killed him. But since he saw that this Egyptian had no potential future, that means no one ever would come out of him in the future, so he killed him. But the obvious question is this: but of course he's got no descendants coming out of the future. You're about to kill him. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. He looks into the future and sees there's no descendant. But of course not. In 2 minutes you're going to kill him. Well, how could you possibly? What is going on? You see this problem. And it's a constant issue in Torah. I'll give you another example. Yishmael is dying of thirst. Yishmael's dying of thirst. Hagar, his mother, is sitting at it. She doesn't want to see the boy die, right? As he's about to die of thirst, Hashem's about to manifest a well that will feed him, give him water, and he'll survive. As Hashem's about to make the miracle of revealing the well to Hagar, the angels say to God, how can you save him? This is a child, Yishmael. He's going to grow up to be a man. He'll have children. His descendants will torture the Jewish people. The Bnei Yishmael, the Arab peoples, in referring to a particular incident, that when the Jewish people went into the first exile, the Arabs came to greet them on their way out and gave them bags that looked like they were water bags to drink, but they were filled with compressed air. And as the Jews tried to drink, they exploded and killed them. Very cruel. Killing them through water. And now you want to make a well of water to save this young man? He's going to have descendants who are so cruel? How can you do that? So Hashem says, tell me, is he righteous now? And they say, yeah. He said, I only judge people as they are now. And so he saved him. So the Shloh asks the obvious question. The angels see a future in which he has descendants who are going to kill the Jewish people. So what do they propose? That he should die now. You've seen a future already. You've seen a future in which he has descendants. How can you apply now to have a prophetically seen future cancelled? You've just seen it. Prophecy sees the future. You've seen that there's going to be people coming out of him who are going to be evil down the line. Now you want God to kill him now, but you just saw that that's not going to be. Do you see the problem? Deeply paradoxical. It's a constant issue. One of the approaches to this issue, the Shloh says, he says this: when Moses looked at that Egyptian, he didn't see the future. He saw the seed of potential in him now. And right now in that Egyptian, he saw no seed of spiritual content that could ever eventuate in descendants down the line. Right? The angels saw in Yishmael now. They didn't see the future events of those people. They saw in Yishmael now the seed of a cruelty that could come to expression later in that particular fashion. And therefore they applied to have it cancelled, right? But they're seeing an incipient reality, a potential that existed. Look it up in the Shloh. He talks about it by Yishmael. It's a long pages long, in which he goes through these types of cases. Fascinating Kabbalistic explanation. But that's a very beautiful piece. Back to our subject. Let's kill Joseph and see that his dreams are false. Reuben said, no, that will not prove that his dreams are false. Maybe the dreams are true, but free will is so important and so potent that you could kill him, and you'll think you were right and you were wrong. So they said to Reuben, what should we do? He said, see this pit? It has in it snakes and scorpions, throw him in there. Because no self-respecting scorpion is going to touch anyone unless he has a decree against him, because the scorpion's got no free will. And therefore an inanimate object or an animal, a non-human agent, is never going to do anything to anybody else that isn't part of his natural dispensation, because got no free will. The problem is a human hand acting against him. By the way, the Maharal says that the pit was not full of snakes and scorpions. Because if it was full of snakes and scorpions, if you throw someone in there, that's called homicide. If you hold someone's head underwater and you say, I didn't kill him, it was just a lack of oxygen. You're culpable. That's actionable in Jewish law, right? You're culpable for that. So if there's a directly homicidal act, then you are definitely guilty. But the Maharal says, but there were enough snakes and scorpions in the pit that it was very dangerous. Not guaranteed death, but very dangerous. Because no snake or scorpion is going to touch him unless that fits with his correct dispensation. And therefore, Reuben said, I'm not against his getting his fate that is destined. I'm just against using human hand to do that. Because then, and it's very beautiful, it says, Vayatzilehu miyadam. And the Or HaChaim says, he saved Joseph from their hand. He didn't save him from his fate. He saved him from their hand. His language is miyada bechiri, from the hand of human free choice. And that's the message. The message is that a person will get what he deserves as long as that is administered by a non-human agency, but a human being who has free will could do something to somebody else that could override the natural dispensation, because human free will is so important that it is that powerful in the world. And this is a very dramatic, classic demonstration. The Zohar takes this piece about Joseph and expands it and talks about it in great detail. The Al-Shikh says the same thing. The Malbim, the Netziv, all the major commentaries say the same thing about Joseph and his brothers, and this is the classic demonstration that you can do something to somebody else that they do not deserve. Let's try to take this one step further. By the way, and I'm warning you, you'll find lots of sources that say there are two approaches. This is the wrong one. The Or HaChaim is an outlier, and he's not right, and everyone else is right. But if you look carefully, take, for example, Rav Saadia Gaon in Emunas V'Deis. He says that when a person dies, death simply becomes a murder. Look very carefully. It's in a paragraph that begins very specifically. 3 lines prior, the paragraph begins like this. He says, when a human being is walking down the street and has a decree of death on him, in those circumstances, when he dies, the death now manifests as a murder. But he's only talking about a scenario where somebody has a decree on him already. He says nothing about a case where a person is not decreed to die, whether somebody else would kill him. So there's no proof at all from this Rav Saadia, and the Chovos HaLevavos is exactly the same. And I don't believe there's any source that says that whatever happens to a person, classic source, that says that whatever happens to a person was decreed already. And there are countless sources that say you could certainly do something to somebody that he doesn't deserve. Now the next step is this. Are we together so far? Any questions? Yeah.
You said that there's a divine decree and there's very few sources that could say that this wasn't going to come true because the free will choice overrides divine decree.
Yeah. I think everybody, if not everybody, certainly most, but I believe everyone who comments on this says that you could override a divine decree because free will is more powerful than a divine decree.
But we have the example of Cain.
Yes.
Right? He was marked 7 generations.
Yes.
No one's going to touch you. On the 7th generation, he got killed by his...
So everybody agrees, even the second opinion, agrees richly and clearly that there are certainly circumstances where a decree is issued and cannot be changed, that God can override free will, that there's no question about that. The only debate is, are there ever circumstances in which you could give me many examples of people in Torah where their destiny was inexorably fixed and nothing could change that. No argument about that. Again, I would be ready to admit that 99.9% of events that happen in the world are simply a human agent fitting into a predestined reality. The debate is there ever a time where somebody could do something to somebody else that was not decreed? Do you understand? So even if you're right about Cain, maybe it was decreed and maybe he couldn't escape that. But the question is, by Joseph or some other circumstance, could you ever override somebody's agreed dispensation? Again, the argument isn't, does human free will always override? No, on the contrary. Probably most times they fit very well. The debate is, could there be human free will so important that it could override a divine decree? By the way, all the commentaries say that even where human free will overrides a decree, it never happens without God's permission. And I'm going to try to explain that. In other words, when the brothers are about to kill Joseph, God's going to look down and say, 1 second, do I allow this? It will never happen without divine, some go so far as to say, without a new decree being issued in that circumstance. In other words, if you find me a source to say that everything that happens fits a divine decree, maybe. But the commentaries say, but which divine decree? Was it pre-existing? Or was the decree now set up in line with this human's free will that God now decrees? In these circumstances, you deserve to die. Are we saying that free will is so powerful it can override anything? No. This power of free will is very constrained. And by the time you see all the constraints, you'll see that it comes much, much closer to the other suggested position. And let me speak out some of the limitations. Here's the most important by far. When we say that one person's free will can override another, we do not mean carte blanche to do whatever you want. We just mean, and here it comes, listen carefully, this is the key, that when somebody uses free will to affect somebody else, you will affect him in a way that was not deserved and not fair, but only to the proportion that he's spiritually vulnerable. We say he needs more schus. You need more merit to protect yourself against a human agent than against a non-human agent. Again, if you have more merit, you'll be protected. We are saying that, again, whatever agency comes against you has a certain power against you. But to protect yourself against human agency, you need to be better spiritually. Or put it this way, you're more vulnerable to human than non-human action. Or put it this way, people are dangerous, in case you hadn't noticed. People are dangerous. More dangerous than non-human. Now, when a dog attacks you or a scorpion or whatever it is, you're in less danger than when a human attacks you. Do you understand? Because here the issue of free will is there. We don't mean you're totally vulnerable with no protection. We mean you're more vulnerable to humans. Just give me a second to explain this. To make it plain, take the case of total merit. In halachic literature, this is called tzaddik gomel. Tzaddik gomel means somebody who's impervious spiritually. Classic example, Mordechai. Mordechai sits in a place where Haman is walking past, and he decides to inflame his anti-Semitic passion to an absolute frenzy. And what does he do? He deliberately sits where Haman is walking past and refuses to stand, to bow down. driving him to such an illogical frenzy that he will self-destruct. That's a very dangerous game. Very dangerous game. The reason is there's a principle in Jewish history called Eretz Nitna B'Yad Rosha. It's a pasuk in Eov. The world is given into the hands of the wicked. Again, in case you hadn't noticed. The world is in the hands of the wicked. The world is not being run by benevolent, sweet, kind people. The world is being run by people who will kill you for far less than a vote. No question about it. That's who runs the world. And therefore, the world is given into the hands of the wicked. And the principle in Jewish history, at least in post-prophetic Jewish history, is we walk between the raindrops and we use strategy. We don't meet evil with a full frontal attack because we will lose. Right? Because the world, the power is in their hand, and therefore we use strategy and wisdom. We don't use power. And therefore, to stand in front of an anti-Semite who is an all-powerful second in command of the world and inflame his anti-Semitism is a very unwise path. But Mordechai knew that he was invulnerable. For what reasons I'm not going to go into now, but he knew that he was impervious, and he could use that to cause this showdown in which he knew Haman would lose. So full house means nobody could touch you, no animal, no scorpion, and no human being. The question is, are you vulnerable? The fear was that Joseph might have done something that made him vulnerable to his brother's attack. Not deserving of death. He was genuine in his prophecies. But had he done something wrong in his past, he would have opened a chink of vulnerability. And on that, human free will could operate. And therefore, when we say that humans have free will to affect you, we mean only in proportion to a spiritual vulnerability. If you have merit, you'll be protected. And by the way, it doesn't have to be your merit. It might be your mother's. It might be your wife's. You might not deserve to die. Yeah, A's walking down the street, right? And B tries to kill him. Maybe A deserves to die. But his wife doesn't deserve to be a widow. Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, they used to ask him, he said he was guaranteed a share in the world to come, he himself. They said, Rabbi, how do you know? He said, my wife is such a tzaddikus. My wife is so righteous. For sure she's going to the world to come. They would never put her there without me. I mean, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that. So therefore, right? Therefore, you better marry somebody righteous, okay? Because, in case you need it. But the point is that it might be your mother. And by the way, if you want a practical output of this question, this is why some people do not buy insurance. Now, insurance is a very good idea. Many great rabbis say you should definitely have insurance, life insurance, definitely. But there's a thinking like this. Mr. A is walking down the street. He has no life insurance policy. Mr. B tries to kill him. A does not deserve to be saved. But Hashem looks down and says, but your wife, who's going to bring home the bacon? Or whatever you bring home. And who's going to bring, she needs you. Right? Whereas if Mr. A is walking down the street, he's got a $100 million life insurance policy, and B tries to wipe him out. God's looked down and he's going to say, your wife's okay. In some cases, she's probably a lot better off. You understand? And therefore, this is a very good reason to make yourself as indispensable to as many people as possible. Single-handedly support so many poor families that when you, A and B, tries to wipe you out, God's going to look down and say, it's just too complicated. I'll put up with you a little longer in the world because a lot of people need you, right? It's not the highest motivation for tzedakah, but it's kosher, And therefore, this is part of the calculation of how your merits could protect you, right, against other people's free will. So the first factor here, limiting this discussion, is we're not saying that a person's vulnerable to free will at all costs, but only in proportion to the lack of your merit. Secondly, the one acting has to have free will. We're not talking about a 14-year-old Arab who is sent onto a bus with a bomb on his back. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a person who's a Baal Bechira. There's no accident that the Torah teaches it by those great brothers of Joseph who are cosmic figures. For Hashem to change the whole dispensation of decrees that were made before, and you need to be a somebody. For good or for bad, you need to be somebody who wields Bechira in the world. So there's a tussle here between the merits of the recipient and the power of the actor. Right? Both of those need to be real. Third, this only applies to individuals. The Al-Sheikh says it only applies to individuals. We're not talking about a group. When a group is threatened, that's a completely different dispensation. We're talking about a targeted individual. Does he have the merit or not? Groups are completely different. When groups are threatened, there's another whole calculus. The Gemara says, for example, Rav Chanan has a wonderful piece on this. Imagine a ship is sinking with lots of people on board. Why are all those people dying at the same time? Two possibilities. Either those were all people who had the same moment of death, so they were all invited onto the same cruise. That's called Mazminam Lepundak Echad. God has arranged a ticket for all of them to be at the same. But possibly, only one of them needs to die. The others just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's called Oile Rosha Oile Shcheno. Very, very distressing. Big difference. If it's the first case scenario, trying to escape is not going to help you. You're invited there for a reason. If it's the second case, get the heck out of there. You're just going down because of somebody else. Right? So, fourth, this does not apply to masses of people. For example, a war. Wars have completely different rules. Milchamos ani asisi is completely different dispensation. 5, Holocaust-type situations where there's a large numbers of threatened people. There the Gemara says, Keven shenitten reshus lemashchis laashchis. When permission is given to the destroyer to destroy, shuv enoi mavchin ben tzadik l'rasha. He no longer discerns between the righteous and the wicked. Amazing thing. When a major disaster, major numbers of people are destroyed, there the commentaries say the righteous often go first. Another whole discussion about why that is. 5, this does not apply to major movements in the world order. For example, the Ramban says this about Paro, that major political leaders have no free will at all. This is called Lev Melech B'Yad Hashem. The heart of a king is in Hashem's hand. Right? A major political figure, mayor of a large city, a president, a prime minister, a king, they have no free will at all. Right? You know the irony in Western society, when a man is elected president, he thinks he has real power. In Judaism, that's when he became a total puppet at that moment, lost all power of free will in terms of what the people need. Doesn't mean he's not guilty, of course he's guilty, but the people will only get what they deserve because nobody has the authority to move the lives of masses in that fashion. That's a part of history's march to its final destiny, and no human has it. So there are many, many exceptions to this rule, many limiting factors, but in general, there is at least a possibility of, in the right circumstances, that somebody could affect somebody else's free will. Let's try and circle back to the beginning of our discussion about the 3 judges, try to understand how that operates. One of the major sources, the Chinuch, speaks about this problem in 2 places and appears to contradict himself. So does the Zohar, by the way. And therefore, we have to find a resolution. There's no way that on a major axiomatic principle in Judaism like this, there can be the same author taking 2 positions. That's not possible. Let me share with you the 2 places where he speaks about this, show you what appears to be the contradiction, and suggest to you what I think is the correct resolution. Here it is. The Chinuch, as you know, is a classic work on the Mitzvahs, right? You can get it in English today. I strongly recommend you all get a copy. You can learn every Shabbos. You can learn 1 mitzvah. Beautiful, right? Number of weeks go by, you learn all the mitzvahs. The Chinuch has a very classic approach. Not only does he tell you all the parameters of the mitzvah, he also gives you what he calls Mishor Shea mitzvah. Not only does he teach you how the mitzvah operates, but why would God want this from you? Why does God want you to give charity? Why does he want you to take a lulav? Why does he want you to send away a mother bird? What lies behind the mitzvah as far as humans can understand? By the way, it's quite humiliating. This is an absolute classic in Jewish literature. It was written for a 12-year-old. It was written 800 years ago by an author who wrote it. His son was approaching bar mitzvah. So he thought, this would be a good opportunity to cheat the kids' mitzvahs. So what a 12-year-old was able to relate to, a little embarrassing for us, but, be that as it may. Now, there are 2 mitzvahs that he talks about which appear to contradict each other. The first one is Reish Mem and Reish Mem Aleph, 240, 241. And those are the prohibitions of taking revenge and bearing a grudge. Right? In Judaism, you cannot take revenge, you can't bear a grudge, right? Taking revenge means doing something to somebody that he did to you. And bearing a grudge means not doing it, but bearing it in mind, right? You go to your neighbor and you say to him, can I please borrow your lawnmower? And he says no. A week later he comes to you and says, can I please borrow yours? And you say no. You are guilty of nekama, taking revenge. You're doing to him what he did to you. In Judaism, that's not allowed. What's bearing a grudge? You go to your neighbor and say, can I please borrow your lawnmower? He says no. A week later he comes to says, can I please borrow yours? You say, sure, I'm not like you. You didn't do to him what he did to you, but you reminded him. That's bearing a grudge, right? In Jewish law, you say nothing, you give him the lawnmower. They tell a story about a man crawling through the desert, about to die of thirst. And on the point of death, another man rode past on a horse, looked at him and left him to die. Abandoned him to die. Miraculously he survived. And a few years later turned out to be the president of a big business corporation. And one day his office door opened and a man came in begging for a job. And he recognized the face of the man who left him to die in the desert. If he would have refused him the job, he'd be guilty of taking revenge. If he gave him the job and remind him, he'd be guilty of bearing a grudge. He said nothing and gave him the job. That's what you're required to do as a Jew. Of course, if you judge him to be unsuitable for the job, right? He's applying to be the tender, gentle caregiver of frail little old ladies. And you feel he may be unsuited to the task. You can say no, right? You're saying no because, he destroys lawnmowers, right? That's fine. Right? But not out of your personal animus against the person, right? So that's the problem. Now, listen to this. Says the Chinuch, why would God not want you to take revenge? Listen carefully. It's a classic piece. Why would God not want you to take revenge against other people or bad? Taking revenge is a very sweet feeling. and a tremendously powerful human motivation. Somebody hurt you, you want to do the same thing to that person. Why would you want to take revenge against this individual? Says the Chinuch, Hashem says don't do that. You know why? Because don't look at him. Where did this come from? When this person harmed you and you want to harm him, look to where it came from. Don't look to him. When a man hits a dog with a stick and the dog turns around and bites the stick, because it's a dog. It doesn't know that a hand wields the stick. When someone harms you, right, why do you want to take revenge against him? Look to the author of your problem, not the agent. What does this sound like? The first approach? Or that sounds very much like the first approach. But here's where he contradicts himself, which shows that we must have misunderstood this. Here it comes. Without going into all the detail, you know there's a mitzvah called Edim Zomimin. Have you studied that, Ezrin? Very briefly, in Torah law you have the following unique situation. Imagine you have a court case. Let's say this person's on trial for his life. Two other witnesses come along and contradict the first two, case closed. Right? That's called hakasha. You have contradiction. In fact, all four witnesses remain kosher because we don't know who's lying. That's a classic case. But in Judaism, you have a unique permutation. Two witnesses come along, these two, and they say this man committed murder. Two other witnesses come along and they say, we have no idea about the murder, but you could not have seen it. They do not confound the testimony. They don't contradict the testimony. They impugn the witnesses. You were with us at that time at another place. You couldn't have seen it. Is this clear? In that circumstance, the Torah has a remarkable and unique, quirky sounding outcome. And here's what happens. The first two witnesses are now judged to be illicit framers of the original accused, and because we believe the second two, and the first two get what they tried to do to the accused. If it was a financial case, they have to pay the money. If it was a murder case, they get killed. Okay? We believe the second two. The first two are judged to be illicit people framing the original person, and they get what they tried to do to him. But there are two remarkable quirks to this case. Number one, why do you believe the second two? Maybe the second two are framing the first two. But here comes a second quirk. Listen carefully. And this is very strange. The first two witnesses say the person committed murder. The second two say that you couldn't have seen it. Here's the rule. If these two are given what they wanted to do to that person, only if justice had not yet been done, if he had not yet been executed. Means that this person's on trial for his life. These two say he murdered. The court hears the case and they convict him. They convict him. He's marched out to be executed. On the way to be killed, these two come in and they say, stop, whoa, 1 second, miscarriage of justice, they're lying. We call the man back, we hear them out, we convict these two, the accused is freed, these two die. But if the man's marched out to be executed and he's killed dead, and then these two rush in and say they're lying, no case at all, scot-free, no case against them. Isn't that weird? They try to kill a man and failed, they get killed. They try to kill a man and succeeded, no problem. Is that weird? Listen carefully. The Chinuch says, I'll give you a ktsasta, at least a partial reason for this law. And here it comes. Listen carefully. He says, if these two people accused the person of murder and he was taken out and killed, do you know why we do nothing to them?
Because he didn't get to see it.
Because what?
The guy that got killed didn't get to see those two die. Maybe. He would have benefited if he got to see them because they're accusing him.
No.
Because Hashem wouldn't have wanted it.
Because he must have had it coming. He never would have got killed unless he had it coming. These two could never have gotten him killed if it wasn't right. Now, which opinion does this appear to be? Number one as well. You only get what's coming to you. And here comes the problem. He then adds one line. He says, you know why a person could never get killed by a Westin if it wasn't his dispensation and his decree? Because God sits together with a Westin. Elokim nitzav ba'adas scale. The way he quotes the verse is, Elokim nitzav ba'adas adayonim. God sits with every Westin or Sanhedrin. In fact, some of Foshim say it's the only reason that humans are ever allowed to administer justice. Who are you to administer justice? How do you know you're right? God says, don't worry about that. You go through the motions, I'll assure it. Therefore, God sits with every Sanhedrin. He sits, it's a principle of Jewish law. It's a verse in the Torah. Hashem sits with every Westin, every Sanhedrin, and assures the outcome. And therefore, if he died, he must have had it coming. So far, so good? Here's the problem. He must have had it coming because God sits with a Westin, which means that justice is always correct and you always get what a decree was, but only in circumstances of a Westin where Hashem is sitting. But some individual acting unilaterally in the street, absolutely not. Because if it was always the case that you got what's coming to you, he wouldn't have to quote the verse about Hashem sitting with a Westin. This is a straightforward diuk, right, gentlemen? A diuk means a straightforward inference. It doesn't get simpler than this in Torah. And inference is, if I give you one case, I'm inferring that case only. The reason if he got killed, that must be correct, he says, is because this was a based in, and Hashem is with a based in, but Hashem is not with an individual in the street acting unilaterally. Clear inference that a person could die in an improper fashion in such circumstances, which is the second opinion. You see that? And therefore we have to re-understand the first. And so here's the correct understanding. And look it up yourself, the words are subtle, but you need to work through the text. He says, when a person hurts you, don't try to hit back at him out of a simple childish revenge, because if you're spiritually mature, you don't look at him, you look at your demerits. Had you merited more, you wouldn't have been subject to him. Had you been a better person spiritually, he couldn't have touched you. In other words, of course we agree that a person can do something to somebody else using his free will, but only to the extent that you're spiritually vulnerable. And therefore he agrees, as all our sources do, that you could do something to somebody that he does not deserve, because free will is so powerful that you could actually affect other people's lives, at least to a degree that is greater than non-human agency. Let's come back to our original case and close the circle, and we'll stop there, unless you have any questions. What was our original problem? 3 people on a base team. Do you remember the scenario? 2 judges are lying, and therefore what should he do? He thought of the Sanhedrin. When a Sanhedrin sits and the final judge has to say his opinion, what should he say? The truth. You know why? Because this is a Sanhedrin. Hashem is sitting together with us. There's no way it could turn out wrong. You follow the rules. He says the truth. The man walks free. He knows what he's doing. Because Aleykum Nitzov. But you're sitting on a based in with 2 jokers, 2 liars. This ain't no based in. In such a circumstance, get the heck out of there. Say, I don't know. Is that correct? When you're sitting on a valid based in and you disagree with the 2 judges, try to convince them. You can't convince them, vote. They outvote you, that's what he wants. But if you're sitting on a based in where your conviction is that the other 2 are not wrong, they're lying, this is not a based in. A based in is not constituted of 2 people sitting there lying through their teeth. And therefore he says this is not similar to the Sanhedrin. In the case of the Sanhedrin, you say the truth, Hashem takes care of the result, and the result is guaranteed. When you sit with liars, that is not, you have no assurance of a divine dispensation here, and therefore in that circumstance he says you should certainly say I don't know, and that is how he would resolve the case. Okay, so in summary, what we studied this evening was the very thorny issue of whether one's free will affects anyone else. You will find this written in many modern sources, that there are 2 approaches to this. Not only that, you'll find that the dominant approach, which is very reassuring for many people, and maybe that's the motivation here, is that all you need is total faith in God and Hashem. He takes care of you. No one else can touch you, and therefore, no one can harm you, right? You're not your mother, not your father, not you marry the kind of lady who needs a place to park her broom when she visits, that kind of stuff. That's not your problem. You would have happened to you anyway. According to this opinion, not so. People could affect other people at least to some degree in some circumstances proportional to various factors that could actually manifest change in the world, and this simply is another expression of the power and potency of human free will. Any questions?
Well, we discussed the Joseph and brothers case as a support for the second approach, and we said that Reuven was in favor of sending Joseph into the pit where there were snakes and scorpions to test whether his prophecy was true or to let Hashem rule. Yeah. So we seem to make a binary distinction between humans having free will and animals not having free will.
Absolutely.
Is there any argument to say that the way that the scorpion or snake is programmed is to attack and to seek the pleasure of eating human flesh, and therefore it's not really a fair situation for Joseph because they'd be...
Animals follow their programmed nature, right? Whatever their own motivations are, absolutely. So you in a situation of danger, it will depend on the animal's programming. Is he hungry? Is he not hungry? Does he perceive himself threatened? Whatever the natural rules are. But that's not like human free will. There's a very beautiful example as well. I think the Netziv says this. Do you know when Daniel was thrown into a lion's den? Very parallel. You got Joseph thrown into snakes and scorpions. Daniel was thrown into a lion's den. Nebuchadnezzar, right, the king, threw him into the lion's den. Very beautiful. It says this. Look at the verses. It's amazing. If you read the verse the first time, it strikes you that you never noticed this. It says like this, that the king threw... You know what happened? There was a plot by the courtiers accusing Daniel of being rebelling against the king. They wanted to get him killed. So the king decided maybe the plot's true. So this Jew, who he actually was one of his central advisors, in fact the Gemara says he used to worship him. He felt this Jew was some sort of a divine figure. but maybe he's an illicit figure who's trying to harm me. Throw him into a pit of snakes and scorpions. If he is all he's cracked up to be, he'll survive miraculously. And if he's a traitor, he'll die. So he starved the lions, and he threw Daniel into the lion's den. And then it says he sealed the pit with a stone. He covered the mouth of the den of the lions with a stone, so that the humans standing by couldn't sneakily kill Daniel with their arrows and spears, and say that the lions, because they'd be mauled by the lions, and claim that the lions had killed him. That's what he did. In other words, he was worried that the courtiers, whom he knew had an antagonism for Daniel, he knew that they may want to make certain, feel that he might be protected miraculously against the lions, and then they would kill him. So to prevent the humans killing him, he sealed the pit, so he was only dealing with lions. So Netziv says, what's going on here? If Daniel's not going to die because he doesn't deserve it, nobody's going to kill him. And he says, not so. He knew that Daniel might be vulnerable to humans when he wouldn't be vulnerable to lions. Because he'd be protected against the lions because they've got no free will. They're only going to kill him if he deserves it. But human beings, all bets are off. And knowing that, the king decided to seal the pit so that because he knew that if humans killed him, it wouldn't prove anything. And therefore he wanted to see how he would deal with lions only, agents that have no free will. Right? Very clear, very dramatic. Look it up, the verse is clear and obvious. Yeah. And there are countless examples of this. I mean, that's just one. Yeah.
You were speaking a lot about sort of leading up to a death, like Gezerah versus Bechira. But I'm wondering if, let's say we have a case where we are totally convinced that there was not a Gezerah, that this was something that shouldn't have happened, that it was from the hand of man. Yet we still say Baruch Dayan Emet. We still are afterwards. We see it in the same way. Is that right?
I'll tell you why. Yes, and I'll tell you why. Because all commentaries agree that at the point of the attack itself, at that moment of crunch, there's divine permission, if not a new decree. That means when the human raises his hand against another human being, okay, technically what happens is this. The human puts this human in a situation of danger. That's what you do. Now the books are opened. And in the spiritual world, they say, do you deserve to be saved? By the way, that's a general principle. When any human being's in a situation of danger, the books are opened. It says when a woman's in childbirth, a person's undergoing an operation. The Talmud says you shouldn't stand under a ladder or a leaning wall. Why not? You're only going to get what's coming to you. No. You put yourself in a situation of danger, the books are opened. Now we need to change the natural order. Do you deserve it? And therefore, when one attacks another, we don't say kills him. We say puts him in a situation of danger. And in that situation, do you deserve a decree to save you or don't you? And if you don't, then the person dies. Yeah, some go so far as to say a decree is now issued, making you vulnerable to that individual. So there's no question the final common pathway is God's will, a decree, God's permission, no argument. The question is, could you ever put someone in a situation ab initio that puts him into that which he wouldn't have been in other words? That's as far as it goes. But that's enough. That's very powerful. That's the way to say it, yeah.
So, what about that moment of Bechira from the other agent opens up the books?
Yeah.
Whereas regular day-to-day living is not so finely watched, I guess.
That's right. And he's only one possibility. You being in a medical situation of risk, childbirth, putting yourself into danger, that all opens books. By the way, even if you flaunt your good fortune in front of somebody who doesn't have it. Here's a woman who has 10 children, and she walks up and down in front of the house of a lady who doesn't have any children at all. And the lady looks through the window and she has a feeling of a pang of pain, of jealousy. It opens the books in the spiritual world. When she thinks, God, why don't I deserve it? Does that lady deserve it? The books are opened. Does she indeed?
Does the analysis change at all with like suicide, or where you put yourself in a situation of gross negligence?
Yes.
There's free will there, but also
when suicide or a person harming himself doesn't raise this philosophical question, because it could well be that a decree of death is deserved by this person because he's putting himself in this situation of danger. By the way, even there the commentaries say that if this person is not meant to die at this moment for certain divine reasons, he wouldn't even manage to kill himself, because that always overrides, right? The halachic debate about suicide is, are you obliged to stop someone trying to kill himself since he doesn't want to live? Do you have an obligation to save his life? And secondly, do you have an obligation to put yourself in danger to save his life? So I wrote another book about that, and you'll see a copy over there. That's an even better book. You need to buy 3 copies of that. But that talks about, do you have the how much risk do you have to put yourself at to save someone else, when after all he doesn't value his own life at that point. The bottom line is we do that. But an interesting logic about why we do that. But they don't have the same philosophical problem. Here we're talking about you're putting someone else in danger that he didn't deserve. When it's you can say you deserve this. You did that to yourself, that you certainly have free will to do that. Yes, please.
So anytime someone dies or gets hurt by something not from another person, like say someone gets cancer and dies, that's always, they had that coming basically. Like that's a divinely ordained, like this is the time for them to die.
Absolutely, yes. We're talking about a situation that's not due to any negligence. You're not talking about a long-term smoker who knew that it was dangerous.
Right. So
you're talking about somebody...
Cancer that just
happened. Yes. Not only that, even a situation caused by another human where it's a child or a group thing or somebody. You understand all the situations we delineated that are not subject to this power of free will? Absolutely. And certainly an illness that came out of the situation. Or when a child is ill who never got into the whole category of responsibility in the first place. And there's so many human situations where it's clearly... The ones that challenge us more are the ones where you don't see that, where it does appear to be another human being, and we don't see why it's fair. Yeah.
I mean, just to piggyback off the topic he was mentioning, there's a certain reality that there's a domino effect where even mitzvahs affect certain organs of the body, or certain things that you might have done at one point in your life affect you 50 years down the line. You're saying that we're not held accountable for that because we can't have any practical way of determining the cause of our present condition?
There's a very deep question, and just to say one word about it, maybe we'll finish with this. There's a very interesting spectrum of opinion on that point, and really what you're asking goes to the heart of how powerful free will is altogether, not just other people affecting me. You've asked a question, I did something now, 50 years down the line it has consequences, right? Are those really subject to my free will at that time? So there's a fascinating debate about this. And the most extreme position, there's a lot to talk about here, but I'll just tell you one. The most extreme position on this is one of the great authorities, Spanish authority called Rabbi Crescas. He lived in the 1200s, 1300s, fascinating figure. And he is classically assumed to hold that we don't have free will at all. If you read superficially some of his writings, it seems that human beings have no free will at all. That's not correct. But if you look carefully, what he says is, among the things he says, is that there are many aspects of our lives that are not subject to freedom at all. Like things 50 years down the line, where you are so deeply in the grip of a habit pattern or a course of events that has been set up that you couldn't choose different if you tried. You might not even be aware of an alternative choice, and you have no free will. But you got into that situation through a deep cause, maybe many years before, where there was a subtlety of choice, and you took that line. And it could be now many years down the line where the consequences are being felt and you're way out of the category of free will now, but you're accountable. You're accountable because of a deep root of choice that was made. He puts it in two ways. That's one way. Another way he says is, even when you're deep in the grip of a situation, let's call it addiction for want of a better word. It might be a technical addiction, it might be a habit pattern, it might be a life process where you cannot choose differently. Not only could you not do differently, you couldn't even will differently. You couldn't even choose differently. He says this. And so you do the action. The only thing you're accountable for is, when you do the action, what's your inner attitude to the action? Do you accept responsibility and identify with it? Or do you feel, I wish I hadn't done that, and you repudiate it and reject it as being part of you? That's what you're accountable for. Again, much of your life, maybe virtually all of it, is no longer subject to freedom of will. Your habits are formed, your personality is formed. Many things in your life have taken a certain course of action. And you do certain things. And let's say those things are wrong. And you cannot be held accountable for them. What you are accountable for is, what's your inner response? Are you glad of those things? Do you accept them, identify with them? Or do you feel, that's beneath me, I shouldn't have done that, I wish I could have been different? Right? When you do a mitzvah, he says, do you do the mitzvah as part of yourself? Do you identify with it and do you rejoice in it? Or do you do it out of a habit pattern and don't rejoice in it? That's what you're accountable for. In other words, the debate here is how deep, how pervasive is your freedom of will? Is it actually in the actions? Is it only in attitude? Is it only in some deep root that was made long in the past? It's a fascinating debate about where this begins and ends. Yeah, last question.
Tehillim, so how much does that affect, what your intentions are? Like, my mother is sick, I've been saying Tehillim for her. So how far does that go?
And any spiritual merit, whether it's your prayer, whether it's saying Tehillim, right, whatever good thing you're doing in the world, is elevating your spiritual situation, and others too. If your mother's saying it for you, or you as a Jew, you as you elevate yourself, you lift everyone. We're all organically bonded, right? Not just Jews, the whole universe organically bonded. When the Jewish people sinned and Moshe Rabbeinu was on the mountain, Hashem said to him, you go down because they went down. Now, he wasn't part of it, but he's the head of a body. When the feet step down, he goes down too. And therefore, any activity, right? Rosh Salanta used to say that when Torah is pure in Jerusalem, so people in Paris remain Jewish. And when you do something bad here, the nerve center of the world, you bring everything down. So we're organically interconnected, right? This is our responsibility for each other. By the way, ironically, the Jews aren't always aware of that. The non-Jewish world, totally aware of that. The non-Jewish world always holds us accountable for each other, right? You do something as a Jew, there's no problem identifying us. The truth is, they're right. There is an organic interconnectedness, and therefore, absolutely, when you elevate yourself, when you do something wrong in private, you're harming me. Ruchanan says that every sin between people is also a sin between you and God, and every sin privately between you and God is also sin against people, because when you damage yourself spiritually, you bring down the spiritual level, you affect everybody else too. And therefore, in that sense, our free will is certainly pervasive. Thank you very much.